This is a relay project.
Seriously?
Seriously starts now. Here's Supriya and Ryan.
Yay, it's Wednesday, December 7th, and you're listening to Seriously with Supriya and Ryan. I am Supriya Devetti in Toronto.
Ryan Jesperson here in Edmonton. It's great to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you, buddy. I don't know. I slept in this sweatshirt last night, so I'm not feeling great, but that is the tale of having a small child right now in this country.
You're
They're
playing
just always
hurt.
sick.
And,
playing hurt.
And you've got illness ripping through your household. How's the little one doing?
She's okay. I mean, regular listeners will remember that a few weeks ago she was quite sick. It's come back, whatever it was. She seems to have very similar symptoms, like an upper respiratory tract type infection, high fever. But I don't know. Like, hopefully she'll be on the mend soon. But it's just it's not great. I was supposed to be in Montreal for work this week. I had to cancel that. I'm canceling a couple of other work things that are happening later in the week that I very much would like to be there for, and will make my next couple of weeks a little bit more difficult because I'm going to have to rejig some of that. And I feel like a lot of that gets lost in this conversation of, the pediatric healthcare crisis.
Yeah, it's happening in Alberta too. And I know across the country, I mean, there's intensive care units, in particular at children's hospitals, operating in some circumstances above capacity. We even saw this week, Alberta Children's Hospital has been forced to redeploy 65 staff from a mix of units just so they can keep up with what they're describing as a high level of overcapacity right now. So alarms are sounding across the country, to say the least. I know we don't have to tell this to families that are in very difficult circumstances right now with these little ones.
Yeah, and I mean, like, here in Ontario, CHEO is called in. That's the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario. They've called in the Red Cross to help them manage what they're seeing right now on the ground. And, at least in Ontario, it's been found that we've underspent on health by like $900-ish million, which isn't chump change. And I think we should be demanding more from our leaders on that front. But let's not get derailed, because I feel like you and I can go on for quite a bit on this.
I mean, we like to, every week when we get together, we talk about issues that matter to Canadians, cut through the noise of the stories, and also sometimes it's the things that are landing in our own backyard. And so this is impacting your family directly right now. Yeah. Of course, we're going to talk about it. We'll talk about Bill C-21 and gun control, the anniversary of the Montreal massacre, and of course, Montreal Canadiens legend Carrie Price coming up in just a little bit. One other story I know we wanted to touch on, and this is wild considering where inflation has been. In some parts of the country, double-digit inflation over the past year, the national average over 7%, and it looks like food prices are going to hold at that number. Some research is showing 5 to 7% increase in food costs expected in 2023. People are already having to make adjustments in a lot of households. This isn't the news they're looking for.
Yeah. Researchers have sort of dug into those numbers, and they're saying that an average family of four is going to essentially be forced to pay out an average of just over $16,000 on food over the course of the next year. And that's an increase of over $1,000 from this year, which is already high. So to give, our listeners a sense of what they're going to be in for, I mean, it won't be pretty. And there has to be some sort of relief or solution to this. And I don't really have a simple one here for our policymakers. But if you can't afford food and your heating bill is going up, and, housing, whether it's your mortgage or your rent, is also going up, that's a lot of things going up all at once, and something's got to give.
We'll get to our lead in just a second, but of course there's always action at the Alberta legislature, as if I need to tell you that. And we wanted to touch on this. We spent the entirety of last episode essentially talking about newly minted Premier Danielle Smith and her Sovereignty Act. It's now, of course, the Alberta Sovereignty Within a United Canada Act. They wanted to reiterate that. Well, she's taking it back to the drawing board after being criticized for some of the inclusions described as anti-democratic that would allow the Premier and her cabinet to essentially circumvent the Alberta legislature and change laws, while at the same time directing entities like municipalities, police forces, and others to ignore federal laws or federal directives. So you can see where the problem might be. I asked Charles Adler on my show Real Talk earlier this week whether he thought it was a sign of good leadership or poor leadership to walk back a bill, to go back to the drawing board. He's not giving the Premier any credit. He says he thinks that she just got busted, trying to pull off an illusion, trying to pull off a trick, and she had no choice. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a very Charles Adler take, and I respect him for it. I don't know. I kind of have a somewhat different take, and that's only because I think we should be applauding whenever we have leaders that listen to either expert voices or their constituencies and take that into account. And we are currently in an environment where, because of social media and because everything is sort of positioned for clips and for likes and for hot takes and for their virality, it sort of disincentivizes politicians and leaders of all stripes to sort of say, well, I fucked up on this, and let's take it back to the drawing board. Now, I know that I still have a lot of qualms and issues with the act in and of itself, but I think Danielle Smith and the team around her should be applauded for at least listening to some of that criticism and trying to make the changes, that they've kicked off here.
I agree with you. Now, the follow-up, which is also important. Did they walk it back? Are they going back to the drawing board because it's the right thing to do? Or because even though they have the power, they have the majority they need to ram through that legislation, Bill 1, if they did it, people would be so pissed off that it would bite them in the ass during the provincial election in May of 2023. That's my guess.
It's probably a little bit of both, but does it matter? Ultimately, they are making the change, right?
Fair. All right. Well, it's December now, and last time I talked to you and I both had some work to do when it came to our holiday shopping. Do you have an update for us? How are you doing on it?
I have a little bit of an update, and that is last night at like 3:30 in the morning, as I had a small child on top of me, not sleeping as soundly as she could have. When she finally did get down, I went on my phone because I was wide awake, and I did do a little bit of online shopping.
Okay.
So at least I'm somewhat, I've progressed. Have you?
Yeah. Depends who's watching or listening. So, yes. No, not so much. I've got some stocking stuffers, which is good to sort of, add a little spice into what Santa delivers. But with regards to the big ticket items, I've still got some work to do. I'm probably going to be, finding that mix that most people do of shopping local at like the holiday markets and then also shopping online. But of course, all of us know that makes us a little bit more susceptible to things like cyber attacks and fraud, right?
Yeah, totally. And this is a really interesting news story that came out just this past week, and it's the Retail and Hospitality ISEC, a cybersecurity-focused association. They released a report and said that threats of fraud, so things like phishing emails, either account takeovers, and return fraud, are all expected to peak going into December. Yeah,
so this is something, it's obviously not very festive, to say the least, and also something we want to put on people's radar. It's a good reminder of how important it is to make sure that your team gets proper training on cybersecurity, no matter what industry they're working in, right? Like working with a training partner like We Know Training can help protect your business from risks like these, and their expert e-learning team designs training that actually changes behavior so that your employees will retain and, most importantly, act on what they learn.
100%. And we know that We Know Training specializes in training for regulated industries, and they are more than just an LMS.
Yeah, so they do it all, right? That means creating and hosting and selling your courses, optimizing them to get you real business results.
And if you need to train your team, they offer a scalable solution that's ideal for high-stakes training that really matters.
Yeah, exactly. If you want to work with a training partner that truly understands your needs, has solutions to your challenges, and delivers amazing value against your business goals, talk to We Know Training.
You can visit their website at weknowtraining.ca.
The Lead.
We've just put forward a list, and we're consulting with Canadians on that. We're hearing a lot of feedback around concerns that hunters are saying about guns that they use more for hunting or hunting rifles or shotguns. And that's what we're listening to feedback on now to make sure that we're not capturing weapons that are primarily hunting weapons. But we all know that we need to make sure that guns that are designed to kill the largest number of people as quickly as possible have no place in Canada. And we're going to continue to move forward with that in a strong and smart way. We'll continue to listen to Canadians. We're not going after hunting rifles or shotguns. We are targeting the most dangerous weapons, the weapons that were used in places like École Polytechnique or recently in South Simcoe or in Portapic that have caused far too much tragedy over the past many, many years.
So that was the Prime Minister responding to a question on Bill C-21 as he was there for an announcement with Premier Ford on something completely unrelated, but whatever, that's the name of the game. So a couple of things that jumped out to me there, Ryan. Number one is Ford's poker face. You know he doesn't agree with Bill C-21, and he's managed to just like look ahead and not give the camera sort of any fodder. So good on you, Premier, for that. And the second thing that jumped out at me is that this was somewhat inevitable to have either the Prime Minister or the Public Safety Minister or whomever sort of get up there and really clarify and reassure hunters in particular that they were not being targeted by this. And a lot of folks who know quite a bit about guns, I'm not talking about just like the angry, commentators or that pop off hot takes, but people that actually, are steeped in gun policy and are, avid shooters themselves or hunters, what have you. We're pointing out that this bill and the recent amendments that were made to it in the last couple of weeks were going to dust up quite a bit of controversy. So, I think the Liberals should have seen this coming.
Yeah. I mean, let me just say, I know that it's not productive to sort of like paint entire groups of folks as like gun nuts. But when we say gun nuts, we know exactly who we're talking about. And I'm not talking about the gun nuts, but I'm talking about shooting enthusiasts, hunters, friends of mine, people whose opinions I trust. And I've heard from a lot of them, not gun nuts, not maniacs, not lunatics, not the hardwired sort of NRA style American angry Fox News type voices that we all know. We all know exactly who I'm talking about. I'm talking about people that are responsible firearms owners, oftentimes people that live in rural situations, farmers, ranchers, people that are even out on acreages, Supriya, that deal with wildlife, that have circumstances where rabid animals are on their property. That is a reality that the average urban dweller is not thinking about. Mm-hmm. Not talking about raccoons and pigeons. We're talking about people that deal with real issues. They're really critical of some of the what they would describe as overreach or maybe even a sort of a naive factor to C-21. I wouldn't invoke the word naive. I think that the federal government knows what it's doing with this. The question is, do you think that it could become politically unpopular enough that they have to walk it back?
I think it already is somewhat politically unpopular that they're starting to walk it back. And I think you heard that from the Prime Minister there. And it's interesting that it's taken as long as it has, given that these issues have been brought to the fore by a bunch of folks. And, the political calculus here is interesting because obviously rural voters aren't exactly flying liberal signs, come election time for the most part. And these issues tend to play very well. And I mean, like gun control issues play very well in urban and suburban areas where the Liberals tend to do quite well. But if you look at their support in Atlantic Canada, that's where it starts to get a little bit murkier and where I think that they'll start to, really consider how this could potentially hurt them down the line. And the other interesting thing here is the NDP, right? Because the NDP has a really interesting mix of rural and urban suburban voters in terms of their coalition. Like, do they go forward and support the let's say the bill stays in its current form, right? And like there's all these amendments that were proposed end up going through and all these other guns that end up being captured by this legislation. Like, what does the NDP do? I would imagine some of them don't support it. It doesn't mean that the legislation will necessarily fail, because I expect the Liberals to have the support of some bulk of the bloc. But it's, I don't know. It's complicated, and it's interesting because our country is complicated and interesting, and I don't find we often talk about complicated and interesting issues properly as a nation.
Yeah.
And this should be one of them.
Yeah. Well, and that's why we have Seriously. So every Wednesday, people can dig into it. We promise. From the strategy side, does the Conservative Party of Canada, with regards to its position, its messaging, its support, or more notably, obviously, criticism of this, does it need to pick between hunters and like suburban moms? Do you think that there's a fine line to be walked there where you can preserve the respect and the loyalty and the support from both of those voting demographics?
It's interesting. So they haven't always tended to do well in certain parts of the country when it comes to suburban moms, at least in the last few election cycles. But I think if they stick with hunters, right, and they stick with the messaging that this is targeting hunters or folks that just want to protect their own, livestock or what have you, that's better messaging than trying to paint the Liberals as being overzealous gun control freaks, because overzealous gun control freaks doesn't necessarily play terribly around the parts that I'm in, especially if you've never really been around guns, right? And I mean, I'm someone who hasn't really been around guns in my life. I've only been skeet shooting a couple of times with friends who are, very well regarded and responsible gun owners. But if it's foreign to you, then you're kind of like, well, why do you need a handgun? Like, why do you need, this rifle that has the potential to, kill X amount of people? Like, it's a very hard thing, I think, for a lot of folks to wrap their heads around.
Yeah, it's a big culture thing too. I mean, to state the obvious, proponents for it's hard to not even talk about it without editorializing. I say proponents for looser gun laws. I mean, that sounds inherently negative, right? But let me say, gun enthusiasts or responsible firearms owners will lament, and to a certain degree, they're right. They will lament that a lot of people that have opinions on gun laws don't know much about guns.
Yeah.
And then people will also point out, which is also a fair and important point, that the culture and the gun culture in Canada is different than the U.S. Gun ownership in Canada, from a ratio perspective, there are more guns per person in Canada than the U.S. when you're talking about certain guns, right? And so people will say, well, listen, this is an issue that's relevant to Canadians, but for the majority of Canadians, it is not normal. It is not an everyday occurrence to see somebody at 7-Eleven or in a restaurant or in a movie theater strapped with a holster on their ankle or with a holster on their back or with what you would describe as, people understand colloquially, as an assault rifle slung over their shoulder, like you can see at Walmart in Arizona. I mean, it's just a completely different ballgame.
Yeah, I mean, but I would say that the flip side to that is that, gun control advocates would say, well, that's because of our laws, and that's because we do take a different approach, and it's good that we take a different approach. And so I think it's, it's the way that this issue has bubbled to the surface is an interesting one. Its evolution has been an interesting one. And I think the Liberals, for their part, for the last, before the Prime Minister sort of came out and made that statement yesterday or earlier this week, was sort of they were kind of digging themselves a hole a little bit, because as hunters and the like were pointing out that these guns were going to be captured that do not have the same sort of in like manufacturing intent as military weapons do, or the capability that military weapons do. The Liberals were basically, for the most part, saying it's in your head, but it wasn't in their head. And like, for a government that's supposed to be big on misinformation and disinformation and trying to combat it, that's not a good look.
Let me get a little esoteric for a second. Do laws manifest culture, or does culture dictate law?
The ultimate chicken and egg.
Also, there's this.
Montreal Canadiens legendary goaltender, future Hall of Famer, one of Canada's all-time greats at the position, Carrie Price, stepping in one in a rare social media post just a short time ago, indicating his support for, and we'll talk about this promo code in just a moment, Supriya, but the Canadian Coalition for Firearms Rights. And boy, was there blowback on this one?
Yeah, so he put out an Instagram post with the caption, "I love my family, I love my country, and I care for my neighbor. I'm not a criminal or a threat to society. What Justin Trudeau is trying to do is unjust. I support the CCFR, CCDAF to keep my hunting tools. Thank you for listening to my opinion." And it's him in full camo, for those that are listening to this on the podcast, with like a rifle sort of tucked under his arm.
Yeah.
Worth noting, it's been pointed out by many people since then that his rifle in question that he's decided to portray in this picture isn't actually one of the ones that are going to be captured in this bill. But anytime an athlete says anything, there's fallout to be had. And it's been an interesting last couple of days over this, because initially the Habs come out and they say, Carrie Price, like he couldn't have known what École Polytechnique, what the massacre was. He was just 2 years old. And then a bunch of his teammates also came out and admitted that they had no idea what it was. And, Carrie's heart is in the right place. And he's been very vocal about being an avid hunter. And of course, he is Indigenous. So there are a bunch of treaty rights and traditional rights that he indeed should have. And, I'm also very much of the opinion that athletes should not stick to sports. Go out there.
It's
and
not a
voice
stay
your
in your
opinion.
lane type thing.
No, like go say whatever the fuck you want to say.
Sure.
You know what I mean? Your opinion is valid just as much as anybody else's is, but like you should know what you're talking about.
Yeah, here's the thing is like, number one, what a Canadian way to wrap up his post, which is thank you for listening to my opinion. It's sort of like it added this element where people that were really piling on, I went, hang on a sec, like let's dial it back just a little bit. And I do think, and I can't speak for Carrie Price, but I would suggest that there was probably somebody in his ear that recognized the power of his platform and that suggested that there's a time of great contention right now and that people are arguing across the country, and they probably told him that Justin Trudeau is trying to take your guns away and hunting's important to him. And so he potentially was even, I don't know, I'm just speculating, maybe manipulated or convinced or coerced to use his platform. I think that it's fair to suggest, I'm not saying all athletes are dumb, and I'm not saying Carrie Price is dumb, but I do think it's possible that not every professional athlete is listening to Seriously every week and is paying attention to the national news headlines and following what happens in Parliament. Not to say, just to say, and it's possible that he didn't know right now that the Canadian Coalition for Firearms Rights, which he implicitly supports in that post, was currently in a dust-up with an advocacy group that is working on in memory of the 14 victims of that mass shooting back in 1989. I guess what I'm saying, big picture, is that Carrie Price I find it hard to believe he didn't know about École Polytechnique. I find that impossible to believe for a guy that lived in Montreal for like 13 years. But I find it easy to believe that he had no idea what he was biting off when he posted this.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that. And it's interesting that the Habs decided to go out with he couldn't have known what he was talking about. He was just 2 years old when École Polytechnique happened. Yeah, okay, I was 4. And having grown up in Montreal, the city, and the province, but the city really takes the anniversary of December 6th incredibly seriously. And it's, there's so much media coverage that it's like kind of hard to avoid the commemoration of the issue. So like, I found it very hard to believe that he would not have known what it was and that the Habs would have gone about that way. And it's interesting because after, a couple of days of going back and forth on this, he puts out a clarifying tweet saying, my views are my own and I do believe them. And then he goes on to say, no, I didn't agree with the promotional code either. But the real sort of clarification came via an Insta stories post where I won't read the whole thing because it's long, but he essentially says, my hearts and prayers are with the families and the victims of the 1989 École Polytechnique shooting today. I think the people of Montreal know my heart and my character and know I would never intentionally cause pain to those impacted by violence. Despite a previous statement released, I did in fact know about the tragedy. And then, he goes on to say, I have no control of the timing of the amendment to Bill C-21, yada, yada. What the fuck were the Habs doing? Saying that he didn't know what it was. Like, did they not clarify with him? Do you think this was like a clumsy crisis comm situation?
I mean, you want to talk about significance of an athlete to a city. I think it's fair to suggest that 10 years ago, 5 years ago, Carrie Price was to Montreal what Connor McDavid is to the Edmonton Oilers right now. And if Connor McDavid on the other Black Friday was to divulge that he had never heard of the Edmonton tornado that killed nearly 30 people, I think that people would rightfully have a few questions. Now, Carrie Price brings up the promo code, which brings us to...
Seriously?
Just like the best segueing there, buddy. So that brings us to this promotional code that the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights put up just days before December 6th, offering 10% off merch if folks used Poly as a promotional code. Unsurprisingly, a bunch of people were very upset at this, including one of the survivors of the École Polytechnique shooting and the gun control group Police se souvient, and have come out to really denounce this. But to your point about our gun culture being different from the American gun culture, I don't think the Canadian Coalition for Firearms Rights are doing themselves any favor by trying to act like NRA Junior here.
It's unbelievable. And I interviewed Rod Giltaca from the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights. People can search it in the Real Talk archives. I said, for people that don't know you, that aren't familiar with your group, are you Canada's NRA? And boy, did he push back. I mean, watch the interview. They don't want to be perceived as Canada's NRA. They want to be seen as credible. They want to be seen as driving informed dialogue. They want to be taken seriously across the country from people across the political spectrum. And I don't care about the excuses they're making that the Poly promo code is not related to Polytechnique, but instead related to a Twitter account that operates in memory to impact gun laws in memory of the victims of the shooting. When you're explaining, you're losing. And the timing of this, 2 weeks before the anniversary of the Montreal massacre, is indefensible. And in my mind, like you said, NRA Junior, they're making their own bet on this one.
And that's it for us for another episode of Seriously. As always, you can follow us on Instagram at SeriouslyPod, on Twitter at Supriya and Ryan, or on our website, seriouslypod.com.
That's right. Seriouslypod.com is your home for all of our archives, including connecting to our YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you find the show. We sure appreciate you rating it, reviewing it, and of course, sharing it with other Canadians who need to cut through the noise of the week's news.
See you next week, buddy.
I'll see you next week.
Seriously is hosted by Supriya Dwivedi and Ryan Jesperson. Technical producer, John Hicks. Executive producer, Josh Dunford. Account coordinator, Lawrence Terlego. General manager, Katie Cook-Shivers. Human resources, Lena Shepard. Voiceover by me, Tangi. Seriously is a relay project. For more, check out seriouslypod.com.